What are some solved mysteries? The Sailing Stones of Death Valley. Opening square bracket. Video here. Opening square bracket. Too long did not read. Rocks would magically move up to 1,500 feet in the desert. Turns out it gets cold and freezes the ground overnight, and the rocks would get pushed by the ice sheets that melted under the wind. In the 1970s, a number of Japanese citizens disappeared from coastal areas in Japan. After many years it was found out that North Korea had abducted them. North Korean abductions of Japanese citizens. Edit. Megumi Yokota. Most of the missing were in their 20s. The youngest, Megumi Yokota, was 13 when she disappeared in November 1977, from the Japanese west coast city of Niigata. I have one that most people seem to not know about. Grand Duchess Anastasia was in fact killed with the rest of her family in 1918. She never escaped, and the several women throughout the 20th century claiming to be her lied. The site of the execution of the Tsar and his family was completely untouched until 1991. Excavation found only 9 of the 11 expected remains. It wasn't until 2007 that 2 further sets of remains were found a small distance away from the previous gravesite. DNA testing found that one of the sets of remains belonged to Tsarevich Alexei and the other to one of his sisters. With this find, it proved conclusively that the entire imperial family was in fact executed and buried in 1918. Where is the Titanic? Most people don't realize that half of the people in the world grew up when the ship's location was still a complete mystery. Now, it's old news. The Golden State Killer, East Area rapist Joseph James D'Angelo. A former police officer, who was sacked for burglary and mechanic. American serial rapist, murderer, burglar. Committed at least 13 murders, 50 rapes and over 100 burglaries between 1973–1986. I was listening to the 6-part podcast called Casefile and they hadn't yet caught the suspect. But a year or so ago they finally got him after collecting DNA evidence when he put a tissue in the bin outside. It was a confirmed match. The Bloop, too long did not read. In 1997 a really weird and loud noise was detected underwater and everyone was all, what the fuck was that? In 2012 it was determined it was an iceberg breaking and or rubbing against the seabed. Mary Toft. I mean, really, what the fuck? Too long did not read. NSFW, woman starts giving birth to copious amounts of rabbit parts. Woman taken to London and studied under intense supervision. Turns out she was shoving the pieces up there days before for the publicity. The Siberian Craters. As the permafrost melts, the methane gas gets released and it sometimes ignites. Human spontaneous combustion not a real thing, it's where there was an overlooked source of ignition. Then subcutaneous fat is absorbed into clothing and acts like a wick, basically they're a human candle. The Mystery of Beth Doe. In 1976, 3 bags were found on the bank of a river in Pennsylvania. They contained the mutilated remains of a young woman who was pregnant in her 9th month. Investigators suspected that she was immigrant from Yugoslavia or someplace in Central Europe. Theories went around about being an honor crime, killed by baby's daddy, or fell in the hand of a serial killer. The case was solved by DNA few months ago, and she was a Puerto Rican teenager named Evelyn Colon who was murdered by her boyfriend, who in turn was apprehended. While it doesn't give us who the Zodiac Killer is, just recently his most infamous 340 cipher was solved after 51 years. The Pioneer Gravity Anomaly. Space probe wasn't accelerating away from Earth the way we'd predicted, but it didn't get noticed until the probe got way the fuck out there. Next space probe gets launched, gets way out there, same thing happens. WTF? How does acceleration not work right? Does gravity just change really far away? Turns out the heat from the radioactive death generator was all coming off the same side of the space probe, and the extra particle radiation gave a thermal recoil force, resulting in an extra acceleration of no kidding about 0.000000000874 meters per square second. Over enough distance, it all counts. Bermuda Triangle, Devil's Sea. A triangle-shaped section of ocean where airplanes and boats were known to disappear. Apparently most stories were embellished, and there is so much traffic that goes through the area it's actually a very small amount of vessels that go missing, percentage-wise. El Dorado or the Lost City of Gold turned out to be a mistranslation. It was just the name of some guy that got mistranslated to the name of a city. The Erebus and the Terror were found a few years ago. The two ships were part of an Arctic expedition and disappeared 150 years ago. Opening square bracket. Kids like Cinnamon Toast Crunch because there's a bunch of sugar on it. What Dinosaurus looked like. When I was a kid in the 80s, all that was known were the bones of the arms with enormous claws. Hence its name, Terrible Hand. They were mostly shown grasping a small car because they were so freaking huge. The rest of the animal was a complete mystery. Was it like a giant Allosaurus, one that'd make the T-Rex look like a puppy in comparison? A few years later it seemed more likely to be ostrich-like and an omnivore. Either way, given how rare it is for fossils to form at all, I was convinced I'd die never knowing what this dinosaur actually looked like. Then surprisingly in 2014, they found more bones and it was just the weirdest thing. Once lost my bank card the day I got it. 5 years later upon moving out I found it stuck to the bottom of a lamp. The prophet hen of Leeds. A hen was laying eggs with messages like, "Christ is coming," and people thought the world was ending. Turned out the farmer was actually writing on the eggs herself, and then reinserted it back into the chicken. Edited for gender of the farmer. The tomb of Jesus' previously unknown brother turned out to be a hoax to try to sell the tomb of a nobody for a lot of money. The case of Adrienne Shelley, screenwriter for Waitress. Husband came home to find her hanging in the shower, ruled suicide. He insists she was happy and would never kill herself, promoting another view of crime scene where they found a shoe print that matched a construction worker in the building. Sure enough, the construction worker went to rob her and thought he killed her, so staged a suicide when the hanging ended up being the actual thing that killed her. Not so much a mystery, but Fermat's last theorem lacked general proof for several hundred years, until Andrew Wiles provided one in 1995. Mark Felt was Deep Throat, the key source for the journalists that pursued the Watergate story. I'm still going to say this: the Loch Ness Monster. UK tabloid newspapers held contests for photos of Nessie, so people faked photos for years just trying to get evidence, and each new photo was drummed up by the tabloids whether it was obviously fake or not. In the US we didn't know that Nessie was tabloid-driven, so we took it seriously. But once the tabloids stopped offering rewards, the interest and sightings vanished. The mystery of the missing Croatoan colony. Turns out they were rescued by a Native American tribes, moved to an island to love with that tribe and interbred with the tribe. The blue D6 that my sister always wanted to use was actually weighted to roll 6 more often. The Death Valley Germans. There is a very comprehensive report, detailing years of investigation. Forrest Fenn's hidden treasure chest that he buried years ago and left clues to where to find its location. It was found within the last 2 years, I think. Here's a link to an article better explaining it. The Kensington Rock. Found by an American farmer in like late 1800s? Maybe? Covered in Old Norse runes, which were claimed to be from around the year 1000, which would prove that there were white settlers in America long before Columbus, thereby justifying a lot of the white supremacist claims of the 20th century. Later proved to have been forged by a Swedish settler, just for fun, some 100 years prior. And people are still making documentaries on it, claiming it to be some wild unrevealed truth of America's colonization. Sorry for bad grammar, I have heated opinions on the matter and am in a rush. Edit. I have found myself to be a lying liar. The runestone was falsely dated to 1362, not 1000. Amelia Earhart. She crashed. They found some remains. Also, the Bermuda Triangle. It was all bullshit to begin with. That portion of the sea is no more and no less dangerous than the rest of the ocean. Many claims of ships or planes lost are either a complete fabrication, or they are actual incidents misplaced to make it look like it happened in the triangle. 3 Secrets of Fachima, a series of apocalyptic visions and prophecies which were purportedly given to 3 young Portuguese shepherds on 13 May 1917. The first 2 secrets were revealed, but the third was considered too shocking and dangerous by the Vatican to ever be made public. Until it was released, after all, and it was, well, a bit of a letdown. Roman concrete that resisted seawater, and the missing Roanoke colony. The lost recipe for the concrete turned out to be something we misinterpreted, and the Roanoke colony was abandoned because the settlers decided to live and mix with the natives. DNA tracing was able to connect this. Does ghost hunting work? Nope. 12 or so seasons of it on TV and not a single ghost found. The Solway Spaceman. In 1964, Jim Templeton, a fireman from the English city of Carlisle, was spending an afternoon out with his family when he snapped a photograph his young daughter without much thought. But when he got home and had the film developed, he noticed what has now become known as the Solway Spaceman. The photo shows what many people say is a person in some form of spacesuit. Kodak even analyzed the photo and their experts said it was authentic, lending to the spaceman theory. The spaceman was his wife with her back to the camera. He was only able to see 70% of the frame and didn't realize his wife was in the background of the picture. That missing socks and Tupperware lids are partying hard together in some alternate universe. Wasn't Dyatlov Pass solved recently? Or did they just find a new theory as to what might have happened? How the ancient Egyptians built the pyramids. A French architect figured it out. They used an internal ramp system. Some of the turn stations for the ramps are still there. Really quite brilliant. The solution does not disappoint. The girl that disappeared at the Cecil Hotel. There's a whole documentary on Netflix. It was hotly debated for years, but it's finally been solved. Your mom is in fact the heaviest thing on Earth. Chupacabra has been pretty much explained by a guy who investigated it for 5 years and wrote a book called Tracking the Chupacabra. Long story short, the initial eyewitness thought the movie Species was a documentary. Most subsequent sightings bodies were wild animals that looked weird because they had mange. The lost colony. Turns out the settlers just went to live with natives, and everyone knew it. People just refused to believe that white settlers needed help from Indians. Deep throat. All the Bigfoot tracks turned out to be some guy who made special shoes and just left them everywhere to fuck with people. I saw this on Reddit like a week ago. It was on the subreddit r/Today I Learned. It was an article about haunted houses and what the cause was of it being haunted. The answer was an high level of CO2, which made you hallucinate and see weird stuff. What an relief. The strange orbital paths of planets in the outer parts of the solar system. Conclusion. Pluto. I found my car keys. Turns out my 2-year-old put them in the refrigerator. Maybe you think I put it in there by mistake? No, there was a doll keeping it company. Trump is a Russian asset. Unfortunately no one cared. Devil's Kettle Falls. A stream separates into 2 sections. One continues normally, the other spirals deep into a hole. All sorts of things were thrown down the hole in an effort to discover where the water went. Ping-pong balls, various dyes, it was even rumored that someone stuck an old car down there. Eventually someone came up with a clever idea. They measured the total water flow above and below the falls and discovered they were similar enough to deduce the 2 streams join back up relatively quickly. Not really, but kinda solved. The bloop was the loudest sound ever recorded underwater. Its origin was widely speculated on and many people thought it came from an animal. In the early 2000s a similar sound was discovered coming from an icequake, happening in the Antarctica. This is till now the most plausible theory of origin. I swim in lakes with literally thousands of dead bodies and never really worry about it. Michigan, Superior, Huron.